So we run our sprints as experiments. So we generally do weekly sprints, and we run them sort of based on this hypothesis that the entire team comes up with at the beginning of the iteration. And the reason we do it is that what we want to do is ensure that every week we're continuously deploying software, but we want to sort of anchor our iterations in a user testing session. And we want to ensure we know what we're testing, and we want to ensure that we know sort of what analytics are coming back from that test. And we use that to inform the next week's experiment. And all of this is sort of to the point of we want to pay down risk in a project. And oftentimes that's technical risk, oftentimes it's actually product risk. So I think the thing to be aware of is we're not just thinking about development anymore, we're thinking about sort of how things are going to be used by people and ensuring that what we're developing is sustainable, but it's also going to be usable. So you don't get a lot of cruft in your code because you're constantly sort of refactoring and aiming towards reducing risk in your project. So what we end up doing is we have lots of conversations about stories. And I think it's really important to sort of point out that stories that are understood by the whole team, that are actionable, are incredibly important. So when I say get the story straight, having the conversations with your team about what is risky, how you can mitigate that risk, how you can design that risk out entirely, and then what's sort of the easiest first pass of a story versus kind of the bigger thing. These are the types of conversations that can both get your team to communicate better with one another and also, honestly, get to a product faster. So the other thing we do, which is actually a really fun endeavor, is you've got a bunch of these stories that have come out, you talk them through, kind of through this like hipster cross-up on the wall. And we're trying to figure out what's the biggest bang for the buck, right? So the product owner has the opportunity to take these stories and they put them up on the vertical axis. So highest priority at the top, lowest priority at the bottom. And they're really the voice of the product and the customer at this point in time. What do they feel like is the utmost importance for them for this project? And then both the developers and the designers get to come in and take those feature stories and move them on the horizontal axis. The designer might say, this is going to take 2 or 3 flows. It's going to be actually quite a bit of work for us to sort of solve this problem. That's a lot of work. Or they can say, this is a really quick hit. Developers get the same voice, right? They get to be like, well, I actually see an easy way for us to do this feature. It's going to be, low bucks. So at the end, you sort of end up with this biggest bang for the lowest buck scenario. And what you're trying to do is grab together a set of features that is going to get you to a deliverable whole. So this is something that, as you can imagine, being a consultancy, but honestly for any organization, if you as a development team and really a product team can step away at any point and have a cohesive piece of software that is usable by customers, you've done your job. You're not confusing people, you're not dropping in a bunch of features that are sort of disparate. You're delivering a whole user experience. And so what we're trying to do is ideally every Friday, these sprints that we're doing, we can step away and there is working software that has business value to the customers. So always sort of aiming to the deliverable whole is something that we're trying to do with our teams. And then the other thing, this question constantly comes up, really, and it's where does design fit in? And this is kind of the crux of Agile. A lot of designers are like, I'm not going to be working at the pace that these developers are working at. What we try to do is what we call just-in-time design. So there's 2 reasons we do this. One is that designers are always going to need to sort of have a big picture scenario, and we're not trying to rush them through that process. But what we can do is we can empower developers with things like, you can imagine Bootstrap. There's a ton of different frameworks at this point in time where you can get a product out to where you can test it with just enough design to where you're finding that product market fit. What you recognize when you're doing product development is that the actual brand experience is going to change over time when you're sort of fine-tuning what people want from this application. So what we're looking to do is have just enough design to get us to the point where we can really validate or refute our hypothesis about what is useful, and then we can step back, and oftentimes midway through a project, that's when we do a design spike, and that's when the designers really have a much better understanding of how people are using the product, what they want out of it, what really the visual voice should be at that point. So what we're trying to do is really empower the developers with design tools through visual style guides and using sort of frameworks that exist so that they can sort of continue development without feeling like they're putting pressure on designers and that they're not blocked by design. The other thing we do, and this is just really a fun one, is at the very beginning of a project, everyone has in their own mind their own perception of what they perceive as a project risk. And a lot of the time, you'll watch like the development team like run off into the corner and be like, man, I think this is a totally stupid idea. I don't know what they're thinking, yada, yada, yada. And they see risk in the project that's very different than the designers and the product owner. So what we like to do at the beginning of a project is sort of get everyone on the same page, put a bunch of big question cards up on the wall and say, what do you think is the scariest part about this project? Like, what do you think is your biggest question? What do you think is the biggest risk? And people sort of, go in isolation, they write down on these cards and we put it up on the wall. And these stay on the wall for the duration of the project, and it really sort of alleviates that sort of like infighting that can happen. And it also allows everyone to be really empathetic about what others' like perceived risks are and what fears are. So it's actually kind of a really powerful dynamic to get everyone in line. Okay, so I want to jump into some case studies. So these are two clients that we worked with that were just really amazing. And actually on these projects, it really helped fine-tune our approach to integrating Agile and Clean UX. So Bookrunner is a company that has a really amazing sort of objective. They are trying to make education more affordable for students by having the purchase of textbooks be much more transparent in terms of the pricing structure. So what they were trying to do was get to a place where they could put that information in front of students when and where they needed it, which is effectively at the university bookstore when the students are sitting there with their class syllabus. So what we were trying to do is a mobile solution using SMS and mobile WebKit, because a lot of these kids still have flip phones. And then additionally, trying to figure out what the best way was for them to really understand that they have a lot of different options for purchase of textbooks. So really amazing engagement, really amazing product that came out of it. Second is there's a company called ShareThrough, and what they're doing is they have a platform for native-bred advertising being embedded into their brand content, and tracking that is sort of where they can surface analytics to marketing departments to understand really where their brand videos are where they're being viewed and when they kind of go viral. So what we wanted to do was take all of this data that they were gaining from the distribution of these videos and huge, far sort of nested domains, and figure out where the video went, when it was viewed, and really at what point did it get really popular and go viral, and really who was the influencer that did that. So you can imagine it was really powerful for marketers because they could sort of have this one snapshot of where the distribution and what channels, if it was Google+, if it was Facebook, if it was ShareThrough, where their video really became powerful. So on a macro level, this is a week at a glance at Carbon 5. So Mondays, this is where we're sort of planning out our week, and we're also reflecting on the previous week. So we run reflections, and I'll kind of go into details on this. Tuesdays, when we're specifying, so this is really where we're sort of, understanding what it is that we're working on, starting the work, and specifying what it is that we're going to do with the developers and the designers. And then Wednesday, that's when we're building and refining. So we're actually coding, we're designing. And then Friday, this is when we get our customer feedback. The one thing I will say is that we look to have a flexible schedule. So something that happens during the course of this project is maybe you have more meetings on Mondays at the beginning of a project. Towards the end of a project, your meetings are going to go a lot faster. And it's mostly because you've had those conversations happening often enough to where people feel very at ease to say, let's table this for later. We know what we're doing. Let's have this conversation. So this is just sort of a note that these schedules are flexible, and even though we anchor it with kicking off with an iteration planning on Monday and sort of the Friday user testing, what we're looking to do is we're maximizing efficiency here, minimizing the amount of sort of documentation that needs to happen, and trying to facilitate any conversations between these different groups of people as often as possible. So Mondays, we do our user tests on Fridays. So Monday is really after the week we've had some time to reflect, you come in. This is where we kind of allow the team to do a little bit of wide thinking. And this is the time when design can get involved, and based on what they saw the user doing, we can run design charrettes. Does anyone have any familiarity with design charrettes or personas? Okay, so a couple of people. Actually, I want to pause real quick here. How many designers do we have in the audience? Any? Awesome, that's amazing. Developers? Okay, majority. Anybody that's like product or sales or marketing? Okay, right on. Cool, okay. So charrettes are something that's on the design side of things, but we have found it to be incredibly useful to pull developers into those activities because they have unbelievable deep knowledge into how you can push technology, and that can inform design. So we would absolutely have the developers in for this sort of like broad thinking and ideating on how we could pivot on a product, particularly if we were doing stuff that had a lot of technical complexity to it. The other thing we do on Mondays is we run reflections. Again, I want to emphasize, we bring the whole team in on this. So this is the product owner, the designers, the developers, at the same time running a retrospective. So they're doing the I like, I wish, I wills, with one another, and then we're clustering those to sort of come to learnings about how we can all work better together and what we want to carry forward. The other thing we do is that when we do our user testing, we're ensuring that we're capturing feedback. So we actually have an application that we wrote that's available if anyone wants to use it. It's effectively just like a virtual whiteboard, and it happens real time. So you get to see people writing and moving the notes around. So if you have distributed teams, this is really helpful. And what we do, though, is that this is sort of a living document that allows us to keep track of what's happening with user tests, and it allows us to sort of do clustering exercises about shared observations of what the users are doing with the application. So we kind of go over this, and this inevitably leads to a lot of ideas being generated. Have a whiteboard ready. This is where the product people, this is actually the product owner and book runner, jumping up with an idea about how he wanted to see the two different flows, because we were supporting SMS and mobile WebKit, how we needed to sort of have those two flows happen based on some feedback that we had gotten from users on Friday. So he's not a designer, but he's jumping up and he's sort of informing the designer with some thoughts that he had based on what he had seen the users do. So these are really easy ways, without creating a ton of documentation and delivering it to your team, that you're having those conversations real time, and it minimizes the amount of time that's on one individual person and on another individual person to understand what's been given to them. So the final thing that we do really on our Monday iteration kickoff meetings is that we do our hypothesis definition. So this is something that can come out of just straight discussion, and it's also something that the entire team gets to agree upon. So obviously the product owner is the one that gets to drive the hypothesis, but what you find is that the whole team has really been having these conversations, and so the agreement sort of comes together pretty fluidly. And again, this is where we're sort of trying to figure out what are the features that we need to develop that are going to give us that cohesive whole, a hypothesis that we can test that Friday with users, and what are we going to see as sort of the metric that will either refute or validate our hypothesis. So the other thing that I'd like to emphasize is on Mondays, we give our teams some time to sort of pay down the technical debt. So having a couple hours to do refactoring or do those things that as developers you're like, oh, this part of the code is smelling a little bit, I want to fill out some tests, I want to refactor, I want to... Also, what ends up happening is, as you're sort of pivoting your product, there's features that are not going to get used anymore. See if you can clean this up, keep your code really streamlined so you can continually add onto it as you're moving forward. The same thing ends up happening a little bit with design. There's a lot of cleanup that happens. And the funny thing that happens is when you have people witnessing users using both the code and the design that they created, they are so excited, so motivated to fix those things. So this is actually a really powerful thing to do on Mondays. So Tuesdays, we've kind of gone a little bit broad on Mondays. This is when we really focus in and get specific. I will say this is when we're doing our story writing, but frankly, story writing happens throughout the week. There isn't really a time that this happens or a date that this happens. This happens all the time. But what I will say is that there's definitely an art to story writing, and a lot of it has to do with the conversations that you want to have about stories. This looks like a ton of stuff to write for a story. What I will say is that what we try to do at the very beginning of a project is sort of enforce some discipline around story writing by making it really lengthy to begin. What will end up happening over the course of the cycle of the team is that this will degrade a little bit, but even if it degrades a little bit, your bar is still incredibly high. So what we're looking to do with the stories here is have that conversation, but we're facilitating the conversation with creating a narrative, and the narrative is really identifying the persona that we're writing this for, and then we're saying what it is that we're going to be delivering for them, so the business value. And then we're backing that up with a very clear acceptance criteria. So this is actually pulled from Dan North's BDD. So he's speaking at this conference, which is really cool. I can't wait to hear. This helps us to sort of very quickly run through the scenarios, both as developers to really identify, because we're going to have to estimate this, so we want to really know exactly what it is that we're doing. And it also helps the designers to really understand from both a technical standpoint as well as a product standpoint, because we're all in the room writing this together, what it is that we're going to be doing, what the flow really looks like, what are sort of the edge cases that we need to think about. Having the designer and the developer there talking with one another, oftentimes you come to the conclusion of, hey designer, there's a much easier way we could do this. This is going to be a one-point story if we take this approach versus a full-court story if we take another approach, right? So it has that conversation that will get you great efficiencies in your development, and it allows the designers to really understand the trade-offs there from a development perspective. So the other thing that's going to end up happening at some point in your project is you're going to have a ton of stories. So is anyone here familiar with story mapping? Okay. Okay, so this is actually a really effective way. If you start to label your stories with either the personas that you're kind of creating these stories for, or sort of specific, search or account, or labels that really specify what those stories are in sort of an epic context, this will give you this high-level macro view of really where the product is heading. This is really helpful for product owners that get really itchy about what is it that my development team is doing, and it allows them to sort of go upwards in the company and say, look, this is where the product's going, this is what we're doing, sort of this is how we're meeting the user needs. So we actually, we wrote an application called StoryMapper.io for this. If you use Pivotal Tracker and you use labels, it literally will just suck it in automatically and create the story map for you. And then you can either print this out or you can just share the URL with folks that are interested in sort of those like macro pictures. So Wednesday and Thursday, this is when, rubber hits the road. We're really getting development done. So we're coding, we're pushing, we do continuous deployment. So at every second of every day, there's a potentially new sort of feature going out, and acceptance, we ideally do rolling acceptance if the client is interested in it. The other thing that sort of naturally happens at this point is that there is an ability for team members to really be empathetic with one another, and so they now can very quickly, if they have an issue or a problem, they can grab one another, developers can grab a designer, and they can jump up and just whiteboard through a situation on the board without saying, hey, designer, I need a design for this. It facilitates those sort of interactions. And the other thing I'll say is, I kind of went through this before, but the developers, if they get to a story where they don't have a design attached to it, they feel empowered to sort of take a pass at it. And they feel empowered because we give them either a living style guide or an actual kit of parts of design tools so that they can sort of take their first approach at this design. Oftentimes this will happen when they have sort of a concept of what the overall picture is, but it allows them to not be blocked by design. And then what they do is, once they're done and they're almost ready to deliver the story, they need to have a design polish on it. So they'll grab the designer, and we do a lot of this where it's a designer and developer pairing together, and they're actually looking at the code and they're doing sort of that pixel perfect, these fonts are kind of out of alignment, we need more white space here, let's get rid of this. They're doing this in the code, so they can just be checking in the CSS or the HTML, whatever it is, and they can deliver it real time with the designer right there, no documentation necessary, no sort of waiting for anyone. So this is a really great way to sort of keep the efficiencies running. The other thing that I'll say, and I think we all know this, is like, as personally us as developers, we actually like to get stories rejected, mostly because it means that somebody is paying attention. There's a critical eye being put towards the work that we are delivering. So I would say if anyone here is sort of doing acceptance for the team, definitely make sure you're doing this routinely. It's the thing that sort of allows developers to know that someone's looking at the work that they're doing and that it's being QA'd as well. So this absolutely pays down risk that might be incurred if no one is looking at these stories as they're being delivered. So acceptance is really critical. So finally, Friday, this is where we figure out how we do it. So in the morning, oftentimes, it's sort of cleaning up the code, doing QA, sort of integration testing manually through the code, and ensuring things are ready for the users that you're going to bring in this afternoon. So user testing is something that we've tried to make as lightweight as possible and as continuous as possible during the course of our projects. And the reason is that if you can dedicate, your Friday beer time to bringing in 5 users to test out your application, you're going to get such great feedback on what it is that you're producing to inform what you're doing the next week. The one thing to note is that plan this out. So figure out sort of what is the narrative that you want to use to test out the hypothesis that you've been working on that whole week. So there's definitely a little bit of a trick to this, and it's good to do a little bit of research into what sort of the pitfalls all of you are of user testing and how to set up a good user test. But try to keep it as lightweight as possible, otherwise it'll be too much of a headache for the team to really get behind doing it. So for us, we actually wanted to create sort of a physical space because we wanted to test how students were interacting with shelf tags in a virtual bookstore. So we actually used the book runner offices, and we would bring in users to test. We called it 5 on Friday, and we did it in the offices. So the developers were kind of like hanging around, and they were able to witness the users without making them feel sort of awkward. And we would put up these kind of fake bookshelves, and we would allow them to use their flip phones, whatever it is they brought. We bring them in and say, here's like a $30 to $50 Starbucks gift certificate or Amazon gift certificate. And they actually had a lot of fun with it. And so we got to watch exactly how they were interacting with the tags, how they were interacting with the program, what the user flows were like, where they were getting stuck. And we would just sort of listen to them and let them run through the narrative, and we would be taking notes. The other thing that ended up happening on the Nibbly project was it's actually incredibly easy to get 5 students in on a Friday. It is incredibly hard to get head of marketing departments in to test out your application on Friday, much less 5 of them. So what we ended up doing is get as many as you can and keep it as lightweight as you can and as quick as you can. But if you do get someone of that caliber into your office, you want to make use of that time as best as you can. So with the Nibbly project, because the data visualization that we were doing had so much animation and interactivity to it, we wanted to ensure that we were able to test with this person as much as we could in that one session. So we would run our hypothesis at first, and they were able to sort of see the visual language of the interface that we had created in code. And then we would abstract that out onto a whiteboard. Mostly we did this because it ended up being really tricky to get people to sort of immediately understand all of the data that was backing this interface. And we wanted to sort of rev on that to ensure that they were gaining understanding very quickly. So we would throw up sort of the icons, the domain language that we had used in this interface, and we would put it up on a whiteboard and we would start to draw lines. And we basically create a second test for them right then and there. It's almost like a paper prototype, but fueled by their understanding of what those interactions were like. And we could get 2 or 3 more tests out of them so that we could really steer our development the next week without having to create a bunch of code to do that second test. So this saved us literally like 2 or 3 weeks of iteration time because we were able to have the marketers then and there should we go through a secondary scenario. So the other thing, just wanted to reiterate, make sure you're capturing your user feedback somewhere, particularly if all of the team members can't be there. So we do film them, although I have to say it's hard to get people to watch video after a user test. So if you can get the development team, maybe not everybody at once, but stagger them so that at some point in the process, there is an ability for these developers to get to see the code that they're writing in use by end user. It's incredibly powerful. And the other thing is that all of this actually takes a lot of discipline, and you are absolutely going to get pushback immediately from everyone on the team. Designers, developers, everyone is going to sort of complain about this. If you can get them to buy in for the first couple of weeks, you start to really get this rhythm of working with one another, and people will see the value in it. They will see the value of putting stuff in front of the users. They'll see the value in talking with the design team. You know, ideally in my world, at some point in time, we will see the value in including some of the sales and marketing team in this to facilitate that. And all of this is sort of my big belief is that we have conflict with one another, but out of that conflict, if there's sort of a process that surrounds it to gather the innovation that can come out of that, that is how we are going to find sort of the next aha movements in product and technology in the future. So these are really the foundations of Carbon 5 and how we work, and we found it to be really useful. I mean, effectively, you're all surrounded by a ton of talent. So let those voices be heard and then have a structure behind them. And we used, design thinking, lean startup, and agile. We pulled from all of those different processes to really create this that will structure our team so that we can move forward and create products that are better. The other thing is, given a culture where everyone is accepted and all of those voices are allowed to be heard, it empowers everyone and it creates a lot of empathy with the team. And then finally, short and iterative is going to allow for people to see their ideas vetted and allow them to continually be interested in their work. They're not sort of like seeing drag happen. So as much as you can keep that cadence moving and anchor it with the Monday and Fridays, that's really the sort of core of what we do on a weekly basis. So that's all I've got. I definitely wanted to leave some time for questions. And feel free to come up. I've got some information about Carbon 5. There's stickers if you want some stickers. But if you have any questions, this is sort of...
Do you have 1 week sprints?
All of our sprints are 1 week, so.
And is that it's across the board? Have you tried this approach with the longer sprints?
We have, it's been a really long time since we've had 2 week sprints. We like to try to keep things as quick as possible. It keeps the team moving really fast. I would absolutely say that this could work with 2 week sprints. You're just sort of lengthening it out. The one thing that does happen a lot of the time is that you'll skip a user test on a Friday, which is something that inevitably it happens. You just weren't able to line up the teams, to come in to do the testing, and that's when you sort of lengthen it out to 2 weeks. I will say it is a little bit disruptive when it happens that way. People seem to really enjoy sort of that weekly cadence.
In this model, do you serialize feature development, or do you do concurrent during a given sprint?
It's all concurrent. Everyone. So, teams can get as big as like 12, and you can have multiple features being developed. We use GitFlow, or people familiar with GitFlow. So you have your branches that are attached to your stories, and each individual team of developers is working on their own individual branches, and so you can do concurrent feature development.
What is the ideal story point for your story? I mean, what you say is like 3, 5, whatever.
We use Fibonacci, and the one thing I will say about points are that any story that's an 8-point automatically needs to get broken down. The 5-point stories, I will say that there are weeks where you have a bunch of really technically heavy stories because you see some technical risk in the project. Those are the weeks where we do see sort of value in skipping a user test, because what we're trying to do is really, pay down that technical risk. What generally the stories are, if we can, we optimize for somewhere between, around like below the 5-point threshold. Yeah.
How do you respond if the sprint hypothesis is proven false or fails halfway through the sprint?
That always happens, and it's totally fine. The hypothesis proving fail is twofold. One, it's kind of interesting because I think a lot of product owners are very sort of wedded to their ideas, and that's actually fine. But when they can sort of see, the development team doing exactly what they want to do and, where they see value for the product, but then they put it in front of their customers that they brought in that are the exact sort of market target that they wanted, and they see that that's actually not valid, it's an incredibly powerful experience for them. And it allows them to sort of like step away from this, their sort of hold on what they feel like was the high value and try something else. So, having sort of the hypothesis being refuted is actually fine. And what ends up happening is that over the course of time, what you're seeing happen is that they're getting closer and closer to really finding the thing that their users value. And that's what keeps the whole team sort of moving in lockstep with one another, because everyone sort of sees, oh, the thing that we're doing, people like that actually, and we're doing more of that.
On a given team, what's your general ratio of designers to developers?
That's a good question. So this does change. What ends up happening, the bigger the team, and because we work with clients, what ends up happening is that there's usually a design lead on the client side and a design lead on our side. We have sort of seen success. I kind of said before that we don't have managers, and we actually don't, but what we do have is sort of this person that is like a product owner. So on really big client engagements, particularly with bigger companies like Autodesk or Skype or whatever, we're seeing sort of the need of someone that can kind of streamline the process across the two teams, even if the teams are co-located. So that is sort of a scenario where we're having more designers for developers.
When you say test, can you elaborate? Can you automated or is it?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. So we do test-driven development. We have unit tests, integration tests. We do a full stack of tests. So every time we deliver a feature, it goes through, our continuous integration server. It runs the suite of tests before it even gets deployed to staging. That is automated, and we're very that's the one thing that we're pretty dogmatic about, is that we want to have robust tests in our software. The secondary test is really more of, it's a product test and it's the user test. So this is more where you're saying, there's the code that we wrote and there's tests against that to ensure that it's written well, that it's clean, that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. But there's this secondary test of, is our product really doing what the business should be doing? Is it doing what users want it to do? And that's sort of the user test. And there's a whole sort of entire talk around user testing. But if you can put something in front of the type of person that you have identified as being a target audience of your product and get feedback from them and make sure you're not influencing that feedback, you really are testing whether or not that product has got legs and those features that you're creating are really valuable as parts of that product. Does that make sense?
So when does when this before the automated testing, when does that happen?
For the automated testing, we do test-driven development. So you literally write a test, you watch it fail, and then you implement it and you watch it go green.
But that's more from development, right? But from QA perspective, they have to So we have not done a ton of, we've partnered with QA firms that will come in sort of at milestones during the course of the project and do QA testing. What ends up happening on sort of this weekly basis is because you do automated tests that fixes a lot of bugs automatically. You also, you sort of force that notion of acceptance that I was talking about. So you have somebody that is doing critical acceptance of the story, meaning that they're walking through it, they're doing integration, they're trying to find edge cases. That's acceptance. That also sort of makes sure that there's a pass on bugs. And then when the users use it, that's also an opportunity. We generally do sort of like, we run through the narrative that we're going to give to the users before we actually give it to them. So we find bugs in that point and we're fixing them before they come in, but then we have the opportunity for them. So when you're doing that every single week, you're sort of constantly fixing bugs as you go through the process. And then if there's going to be a huge public release, backed by a bunch of marketing, that's when oftentimes clients will request to have a QA team. The QA team in that scenario, what we end up giving them are narratives that we give during the user tests, but we also actually can sort of print out all of our integration tests and give that to them because that's really descriptive sort of, clear by clear what the system is doing, and they can use that to run their tests.
Are there situations where your client asks you to use, I guess, an external design agency? And if so, how does that change the relationship between devs and designers? How does that change the flow?
Yep, it changes it dramatically. I will absolutely admit. So we have always traditionally partnered with design firms. We got to work with we still do all the time. We work with IDEO, we used to work with Hot Studio, we work with the Office. So really awesome design firms. And everyone sort of has the same objective. They want to see the thing that they design get built. And they want to see it get built in sort of their vision. So what ends up happening is that what they've designed, when you start to implement that and make it work, changes need to happen. So what we have requested at this point from people that we partner with, from design firms, is that early on in their process, we have weekly check-ins with our dev team so that they can kind of present what they're designing, and our dev team has an opportunity to say, you actually can't do this, or did you think about these edge cases for this, form or whatever it is. So that's sort of one way that we tackle that. And then we request that they have a design resource available to us at sort of part-time through the duration of the development cycle. And then we bring them in for that Monday and Friday. So they're not there the whole week. They're available real time that week. So usually we have an IRC chat scenario with them. But we sort of require that the Monday and Friday there. And that, it's tricky. I mean, I will absolutely say that that's the perfect world, and that's not always the case. Oftentimes you're wrangling people and trying to get sort of feedback from them. But it is, when we step off into the project, that's sort of the requirement that we set out. Any other questions? Cool. I think I finished up early. If you guys have one more.
Could you talk about the estimation and how you plan? I know you just mentioned about using the
Yes.
But how many points do you go for in a given sprint? And how do you prioritize? How long?
So we don't necessarily prioritize for points. We prioritize for features. So what we're trying to do is, once again, from the client's point of view, what they want is sort of, as much as they can get in for that Friday, right? And what we do is we try to guide them to say, well, you can go really deep into something and test that, or we can take a broad stroke. So here are the smallest things we can do to sort of get through this entire flow. So it's sort of an education process of trying to figure out what are the things that you can do in a week that are going to be useful and that are going to maximize, not necessarily the points, because you could have a 5-pointer that produces no value in the product. We're trying to optimize for the most value that we can produce for the product at the end of the week. And so a lot of that time is you can imagine maybe we need to do a deep spike into a technical risk, and that's the 5-pointer. And so we minimize the amount of sort of user testing or the user facing features that we're doing that week. Or we know that we want to have actual user facing features, and we're trying to figure what is the minimal amount that we need to do on the dev side and design side to put something in front of that user to see if they're even interested in this kind of set of features for this product. Does that make sense? Yeah. Points are a little bit tricky because I think a lot of people think of them as time, and they do, over the course of a project, actually sort of map to time, but we're looking at them more in relevance to one another. This story is really heavy, we can break it down into these little stories and get 2 of them done versus doing the big one.
So do you give any kind of benefit, the benefit, any kind of numeric value to?
It's velocity, right? And velocity is effectively we have a team strength of 6, so there's 6 developers, and we have a velocity of 26. So we know, given the stories that we have in the backlog right now, this is how much that we're going to get done before this date. So we definitely can do that. And as the project progresses, you get more and more sort of accurate in that estimate because you've done more features, you've sort of accepted them and seen sort of how the velocity runs naturally. So that's sort of how we can estimate against time. Does that answer the question? Okay.
For the You mentioned like big running to for a sprint or several before that. Do you still have developers developing new features, or are you having them focus more on QA and getting the product shipped?
I would absolutely say that when you're ready to do a big release, that there does start to be a focus at those end weeks towards ensuring that, you know, bugs are fixed, big things that have come up, that you're making sure you're focusing on those.
You kind of reserve the work for QA as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've ever reserved a week. Usually there's some features that get pushed in that last week. It was funny because we used to sort of really try to pressure the client to not have that week be just about feature, or to not have any features in that last week. But it sort of actually ended up being that because of this process, we didn't have a ton of bugs to fix at the end. So unless, you know, something big comes up at the end, in which case we would define a week, usually there's feature development being done. I'm pausing here because there are weeks in which, particularly with clients that are coming in with existing code bases, we find a part of that code base that needs refactoring or it needs tests to fill it out. We absolutely will have weeks where there is no designers, no user testing. We are literally refactoring code. Cool. Thank you all so much. I hope you got something out of that. And if you have any additional questions, please come see me and come grab a sticker if you're interested.